Welcome to Scary Historian, where history's darkest stories come to light. I'm your host, and tonight I have not one, but two horrifying true stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. Our first tale takes us to 16th century Hungary, to a castle where nobility and madness collided in the most terrifying way imaginable. Our second, well, let's just say it involves a London physician whose treatments were more horrifying than any disease. But before we begin this journey into darkness, if you're new to Scary Historian and you love uncovering history's most chilling secrets, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what we uncover here. Now, let's begin with a question that will haunt you. What happens when vanity becomes a deadly obsession? December 30th, 1610. The wind howled through the Carpathian Mountains as Count Jerzy Thurzo approached the towering gates of Szeged Castle. He carried with him a warrant from King Notorious II himself, and what he was about to discover would become one of history's most horrifying cases of serial murder. But our story begins 50 years earlier, in a world where noble blood was believed to carry actual power. Elizabeth Bathory was born on August 7, 1560, into one of Hungary's most powerful families. The Bathorys weren't just wealthy, they were connected to royalty, and with that connection came a belief that their bloodline was somehow special. From childhood, Elizabeth showed signs of the cruelty that would later define her. Servants whispered of a young girl who would torture small animals, who seemed to take pleasure in others' pain. But in 16th century nobility, such behaviors were often overlooked or, worse, encouraged as signs of strength. At 15, Elizabeth was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, known throughout Eastern Europe as the Black Knight for his ruthless military campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. Ferenc was everything a Hungarian noble was supposed to be: violent, merciless, and utterly without compassion for his enemies. He was also Elizabeth's perfect teacher. During Ferenc's long military campaigns, Elizabeth was left alone to manage their vast estates. And it was during these lonely years that she began to experiment with what she called discipline for her servants. The first documented incident occurred in 1594. A young servant girl named Anna was caught stealing bread from the castle kitchens. Elizabeth's punishment was excessive. She had the girl stripped and tied to a post in the courtyard, where she was beaten with iron rods until she died. But here's where the story takes a turn from simple cruelty to something far more sinister. According to witness testimonies collected years later, as Elizabeth watched Anna die, she noticed how the girl's blood splattered across the stones and how it seemed to make them shine. This observation would plant a seed in Elizabeth's mind, a seed that would grow into an obsession that would claim hundreds of lives. Ferenc died in 1604, officially from illness, though some historians suspect poison. With her husband gone, Elizabeth's behavior became increasingly erratic. Servants began disappearing from the castle at an alarming rate, and the local villages started to notice that young women who went to work at Szeged Castle were never seen again. The legend says it began with Elizabeth's vanity. One day, a servant girl accidentally pulled the Countess's hair while brushing it. Elizabeth struck the girl so hard that blood splattered across her own hands. But as she looked down at the blood on her skin, she became convinced that it had made her appear younger. Whether this moment actually happened or was constructed later to explain her actions, what followed was undeniably real. Elizabeth Bathory began systematically murdering young women, believing that bathing in their blood would preserve her youth forever. She didn't work alone. Elizabeth assembled a team of accomplices who would help her carry out her horrific rituals. There was Anna Darvulia, a local woman rumored to be a witch, who supposedly taught Elizabeth the art of blood bathing. Dorothea Countess, known as Dorko, who specialized in torture. Katerina Banica, who helped dispose of bodies. And Jano Živari, a manservant who constructed the devices used to extract blood from victims. The methods they used were unspeakable. Girls were beaten with clubs, whipped with thorn branches, and burned with red-hot irons. In winter, they would be stripped naked and left in the castle courtyard, where servants would pour cold water over them until they froze to death. But perhaps most horrifying of all were the blood baths themselves. Witnesses later testified that Elizabeth would have victims suspended over large tubs, where they would be cut and bled like livestock. She would then bathe in their blood, sometimes drinking it, believing that each horrific ritual would transfer their youth to her. For nearly a decade, this continued. The exact number of victims may never be known, but estimates range from 80 to over 600 young women. Elizabeth kept detailed records of her activities, a diary that investigators would later discover, filled with meticulous notes about her treatments and their supposed effects. But Elizabeth's appetite grew, and with it, her carelessness. Initially, she targeted peasant girls from local villages, women whose disappearances might go unnoticed or uninvestigated. But as her obsession deepened, she began to prey on daughters of minor nobility, sending out invitations to young women from good families to come to the castle for education in courtly manners. These higher-born victims couldn't simply vanish without consequences. Families began asking questions. Letters were sent to the royal court. And finally, King Matthias II authorized an investigation. On December 30th, 1610, Count Georgi Thurzo arrived at Szeged Castle with soldiers and investigators. What they found defied comprehension. The official report, still preserved in Hungarian archives, describes a scene of unimaginable horror. Bodies were found in various stages of decomposition throughout the castle. In the dungeons, living victims were discovered, tortured, and broken, awaiting their turn for Elizabeth's rituals. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Elizabeth herself. When the investigators found her, Elizabeth Bathory was in her private chambers, calmly applying what appeared to be a reddish cosmetic to her face. It took them several moments to realize that the cosmetic was dried blood. Elizabeth showed no remorse, no recognition that she had done anything wrong. In her mind, she had simply been taking care of herself, preserving her beauty through methods that seemed perfectly logical to her twisted worldview. Because of her noble status, Elizabeth could not be executed. Instead, she was sentenced to solitary confinement. The windows and doors of her chambers were bricked up, leaving only small openings for food and air to pass through. For 3.5 years, the Blood Countess lived in that stone tomb. Guards reported that they could hear her talking to herself, sometimes screaming, sometimes laughing. She claimed she could see her victims in the darkness, that they were calling to her, begging her to join them. Elizabeth Bathory died on August 21st, 1614. When guards finally broke down the walls of her makeshift prison, they found her lying on the floor, her fingers bloody from scratching at the stones. But her legend was just beginning. Over the centuries, Elizabeth Bathory became a figure of folklore and legend. She inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula, influenced countless horror stories, and became known as history's most prolific female serial killer. But here's what's truly terrifying. Recent historical research suggests that the story we've been told might not be the whole truth. Some historians now believe that Elizabeth Bathory may have been framed by political enemies who wanted to seize her vast wealth and lands. Which brings us to a chilling question. Was Elizabeth Bathory a monster? Or was she the victim of a conspiracy so successful that it turned her into a legend of evil for over 400 years? We may never know the complete truth. But what we do know is that the story of Elizabeth Bathory reminds us of a terrifying fact about human nature. Sometimes the most horrifying monsters are those who believe they're simply taking care of themselves. Now, let's travel to a different time and place, but a story no less horrifying. London, 1828. The city was in the grip of unprecedented medical advancement, but behind the gleaming surgical theaters and prestigious anatomy schools lurked a trade so gruesome, so morally corrupt, that it would shake Victorian society to its core. This is the story of Burke and Hare, the Edinburgh body snatchers, and Dr. Robert Knox, the anatomist whose hunger for fresh corpses would lead to one of the most shocking murder sprees in British history. But to understand this story, we need to understand the world of 19th century medicine. Doctors were making incredible advances in surgery and anatomy, but there was one critical problem. They needed human bodies to study and practice on. British law only allowed the bodies of executed criminals to be used for medical dissection. But with hundreds of medical students needing to study anatomy and only a handful of executions each year, there simply weren't enough legal corpses to go around. Enter the resurrection men. Body snatching, or resurrection, became a thriving underground trade. Professional grave robbers would wait for fresh burials, then return under cover of darkness to dig up the recently deceased and sell them to anatomy schools for substantial sums. The practice was technically illegal, but authorities often looked the other way. After all, the advancement of medical knowledge was seen as a noble cause, and what harm could come from using bodies that were already dead? That attitude would change in 1828. William Burke and William Hare were Irish immigrants living in Edinburgh's impoverished Westport district. They weren't doctors, weren't students, weren't even particularly intelligent men. They were simply opportunists who discovered that the human body had become a valuable commodity. It started innocently enough. An elderly tenant in Hare's boarding house died of natural causes, still owing rent money. Rather than report the death immediately, Burke and Hare decided to sell the body to Dr. Robert Knox at Edinburgh's prestigious anatomy school. Dr. Knox paid them £7 and 10 shillings, a fortune for men like Burke and Hare. More importantly, Knox asked no questions about how they had obtained the body. He simply paid cash and requested that they keep him in mind for future opportunities. That transaction would set in motion a series of events that would terrorize Edinburgh and expose the dark underbelly of medical education. Burke and Hare realized they had discovered a gold mine, but there was one problem. They couldn't rely on tenants dying of natural causes. Bodies needed to be fresh to be valuable to anatomists, and grave robbing was dangerous work with unpredictable returns. so they decided to create their own supply. Their first victim was another elderly tenant, a man named Joseph, who fell ill in February 1828. Rather than helping him recover, Burke and Hare plied him with whiskey until he was unconscious, then suffocated him with a pillow. The method was perfect for their purposes. Suffocation left no marks, no obvious signs of violence. To any medical examiner, Joseph would appear to have died of natural causes, perhaps his illness, perhaps the effects of alcohol. Dr. Knox paid them £10 for Joseph's body, no questions asked. And so began one of the most calculated and cold-blooded murder sprees in criminal history. Over the next 10 months, Burke and Hare would murder at least 16 people, possibly more. Their victims were Edinburgh's most vulnerable residents, elderly pensioners, prostitutes, homeless individuals, people who wouldn't be missed or whose disappearances wouldn't be investigated. They developed a system that was both simple and terrifyingly effective. Burke and Hare would identify potential victims, usually people who were already drinking heavily or appeared to be in poor health. They would invite these individuals to their lodgings, offer them more alcohol, and once the victims were unconscious, they would suffocate them. The murders were so carefully planned that they even developed their own technique, later called Burking. One of them would sit on the victim's chest while the other covered their mouth and nose. Death would come quietly, without struggle, leaving bodies that appeared to have died naturally. Meanwhile, Dr. Robert Knox was building his reputation as one of Edinburgh's premier anatomists. His lecture theater was always packed with students eager to study the fresh specimens he somehow managed to provide on a regular basis. Knox prided himself on the quality of his subjects. While other anatomy schools made do with bodies that had been dead for days or weeks, Knox always seemed to have specimens that were remarkably fresh, so fresh that they often still exhibited lifelike flexibility and coloration. If Knox suspected anything unusual about his regular suppliers, he never let it interfere with business. But Burke and Hare's success would ultimately lead to their downfall. As they became more confident, they became less careful about choosing victims. In October 1828, they made a fatal mistake. Mary Bathory was an elderly Irish woman who had come to Edinburgh looking for her son. Burke encountered her on the street and, learning that she shared his surname, invited her to his lodgings for what he claimed was a Halloween party. But other tenants in the building had seen Mary arrive, had spoken with her, had expected to see her again. When she disappeared overnight, people began asking questions. When suspicious neighbors searched Burke's room, they made a horrifying discovery. Mary Bathory's body was hidden under a bed, still warm, clearly recently deceased, but showing no signs of illness or natural death. The authorities were called, and Burke and Hare were arrested. But it was what happened next that would truly shock Victorian society. Under interrogation, Hare agreed to testify against Burke in exchange for immunity. His confession revealed the full scope of their activities. 16 confirmed murders, possibly more, all carried out to supply Dr. Knox's anatomy school with fresh bodies. Burke's trial became a sensation. Newspapers across Britain covered every detail of the proceedings, and the public was horrified to learn that their medical institutions had been built on such a foundation of murder. William Burke was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. But the court added a particularly fitting punishment. His body would be donated to Edinburgh Medical College for public dissection. On January 28, 1829, Burke was hanged before a crowd of 25,000 people. The next day, His body was dissected in the same anatomy theater where many of his victims had been studied. Tickets to witness the dissection were so sought after that the crowds outside nearly rioted. Dr. Robert Knox, despite clearly knowing that his regular suppliers were providing suspiciously fresh bodies, was never charged with any crime. However, his reputation was destroyed. Students boycotted his lectures, colleagues shunned him, and he was eventually forced to leave Edinburgh in disgrace. William Hare, who had testified against his partner, was released from prison but was recognized wherever he went. He fled to London, where he disappeared into the anonymity of the city's slums. Some say he died a beggar. Others claim he lived for decades, haunted by the ghosts of his victims. But the Burke and Hare murders had consequences that extended far beyond the fate of the killers themselves. The public outrage led to the Anatomy Act of 1832, which reformed how medical schools obtained bodies for study and helped eliminate the trade in stolen corpses. However, the case also revealed a darker truth about the intersection of scientific progress and moral compromise. How many doctors, how many medical students, how many professors knew or suspected that the bodies they studied had been obtained through questionable means? And how many chose to look the other way in the name of advancing medical knowledge? Two stories separated by centuries and geography, but united by a common thread: the capacity for human beings to rationalize the most horrific actions in service of their obsessions. Elizabeth Bathory believed she was preserving her youth and beauty. Burke and Hare believed they were simply making money from a market that already existed. Dr. Knox believed he was advancing the cause of medical science. Each of them found a way to justify actions that any moral person would recognize as monstrous. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying lesson of all: how easy it can be to convince ourselves that our worst impulses serve a greater good. But here's something that will keep you awake tonight. In 1993, when historians finally gained access to sealed archives from Elizabeth Bathory's trial, they discovered something that had been hidden for nearly 400 years. The records contained testimony from a witness who claimed to have seen Elizabeth Bathory after her supposed death in 1614. The witness, a village priest, swore that he encountered the Countess in 1623, 9 years after she was allegedly found dead in her sealed chamber. According to his account, she appeared exactly as she had decades earlier, no older, no changed by time. When he called out to her, she turned, smiled, and simply vanished. Was it a case of mistaken identity? A hallucination brought on by decades of local legend? Or did Elizabeth Bathory finally discover the secret to eternal youth that she had killed so many to obtain? And in Edinburgh, construction workers renovating the old anatomy building in 2008 made their own disturbing discovery. Hidden beneath the floorboards of what had been Dr. Knox's private office, they found a collection of medical instruments and a journal written in Knox's hand, detailing procedures that went far beyond simple dissection. The journal described experiments conducted on living subjects, procedures that would have required fresh, warm bodies, subjects who were not quite dead when they arrived at the anatomy theater. How many of Burke and Hare's victims were actually still alive when they were delivered to Dr. Knox? And what happened to them in that theater of medical learning? Some questions, it seems, are too horrifying to answer. But they remind us that the past is never really past, and that the monsters we think we understand may have secrets that are darker than we ever imagined. Thank you for joining me on Scary Historian. If these stories have left you hungry for more dark history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And remember, the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened. Sweet dreams.